To me, this program is not a journalistic enterprise. It is about learning. Learning from people who have reached the top of their fields about their vision, experience, aspirations, and passions. In all my fields of endeavor, be it business, public service, policy research, or the media, I ask myself 3 questions. Am I helping to make a difference? Am I doing the best I can? And am I enjoying myself? Take a seat, make yourself comfortable, and let's go. Your Grace, welcome to Sri Lanka and welcome to In Black and White.
Thank you very much. It's most kind of you.
Your own story, it is inspiring, and it's I think, a journey which all of us can be easily inspired by. From an oil company executive to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, if I were to discuss that aspect of your life, I think we will spend the full half an hour on that. So, therefore, if I were to ask for the short version, I think that will be offensive. So I was thinking, what inspired you to make this journey? You know, what was that moment? Was there a moment when you said, well, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to be?
Certainly never a moment when I said, I am going to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, until I was offered the position. There was a moment a very long time ago now, about 30 years ago, back in about 1987, when at a church service in London, I had a clear sense of vocation, which I was unable to escape from, and which led to me exploring the idea of ordination, led to the first bishop I saw saying that he had interviewed more than 1,000 potential clergy and I was not in the top 1,000, and that I had no future in the Church of England. And but in the end he accepted me for ordination, and I went on and was a curate and a parish priest in the normal way, and then worked in conflict management and mitigation work based in Coventry. I still carry my cross that I wear is still the cross that is symbolic of Coventry Cathedral, and a great centre of reconciliation, and then Liverpool, and then Durham and the northeast of England, and then to Canterbury.
At what age were you ordained, if I may ask?
I was ordained in 1992, therefore I must have been 36.
What is it to be an Anglican? What is Anglicanism?
Anglicanism is the result of the breakdown in relations between the King of England at the time, King Henry VIII in the 16th century, and the Pope, at the same time as there was a great religious movement in Europe called the Reformation. And Anglicanism ended up as a combination of Catholicism. It is Catholic in its view of the Church, in the fact it has bishops, and it is Reformed in the sense that it has close links to the Reformation. And so it believes in the development of our own relationship with God, in that every lay person is called to follow Jesus Christ. It has the Bible as central, but it has a strong link all around the world to the parish system, to working with local communities, to reaching out to those who are not Christians and loving them and caring for them for education and health, and is linked historically to the places where the British in the past had an empire.
Have we now moved, I know the connection between empire and Anglicanism, but have we now moved past that? Because you have 85 million Anglicans across the world, and I mean, that is a strong community. Have we now moved past the idea of empire, you think?
I hope so, very much. In fact, yes, quite clearly. I think there's further to go, but the average Anglican is a woman in an area of extreme poverty, probably sub-Saharan Africa, on less than $4 a day and likely to be in a zone of conflict or civil war or post-conflict. And so they are not an English man, is not the typical Anglican by any means. Rich is not typical. So we are post-imperial, thank goodness. I'm delighted.
When it comes to your responsibilities, I know we'll talk about that later overall, but on the international side, as the spiritual head of the Anglican Church, what do those responsibilities look like?
Well, the most important thing to say is that Anglicanism has no equivalent to the Pope. So within the oversight of Anglican churches, there are 40 provinces in 165 countries around the world. In the oversight of those, each province is autonomous, but we are interdependent. We're like a family of grown-up children where there are parents and children, but the children are grown up and make their own decisions. They're autonomous, but they're interdependent. They're linked by history, by faith, above all by faith in Christ. And so the role of the Archbishop is technically, it always amuses me this, I am described as an instrument of communion and a focus of unity. In no document am I described as a human being, it's worth saying. So my role is to be a way of focusing Anglican life around the world, but I can't come into another province and say, do this, and everyone says, oh, yes, sir, we'll do it. They will just say, lie down and have a cup of tea.
Then on the domestic side, within the UK, there is a history to your role, obviously. What are your responsibilities there?
Well, first of all, it's in England, not the whole UK.
Okay.
Scotland has a separate Anglican church, as does Wales and Ireland, including the north of Ireland. It's worth remembering the Archbishop of Canterbury, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, was in 597 AD, and England was not united as a country till the 10th century. So the archbishops have been there longer than the country. But historically, technically, in protocol terms, the Archbishop is the senior person in the country after the royal family, and has both a sort of dignified role, as it would have been called in the 19th century, of crowning the monarch, of baptizing the monarch's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, of marrying members of the royal family, of being in the House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament, together with 25 other bishops, and of being in one sense a sort of chaplain to the state, but also the leader of 41 parish dioceses and almost 15,000 parishes with 8,000 clergy, which cover every single square inch of England. But in that role, again, we don't have the equivalent of a pope. If I want a bishop to do something, I can suggest it, we can discuss it. My view has some moral weight, but they can say no.
Multiculturalism, multi-religion, these words are now coming under stress across
Yes.
the globe. I mean, even in our country, we have
Very
this debate
definitely.
in Sri Lanka. How can spiritual leaders act as bridges, mediate between these frictions?
Well, I think that is one of the great questions today. I mean, in much of Europe and North America, people think religion is declining, but it's 85% of the world's population belong to some faith or another, and it's going up, not down. So even from a purely worldly point of view, ignoring the reality of God, a reality in which I believe passionately, but ignoring that, the need for interfaith dialogue, which covers almost 9 in every 10 human beings, is essential. How can it happen? I want to be very clear, the first step is religious leaders must take responsibility. There has been a history both for Christians and for other faiths, but I'll talk about Christians because I don't criticize other faiths in that way, where when something terrible happens, say the massacre at Srebrenica in 20 years ago, where 7,000, 8,000 Muslim men and boys were murdered in the Bosnian War, where the Christian leaders say the people who did that are not real Christians. It won't do. They may not be good Christians, they may be terrible. In fact, they are very wicked people indeed. But something within the faith in which they grew up made them feel that somehow it was all right to do this utterly inhumane, deeply evil act. Christian leaders need to say, what is it about the history of Christianity, how we've spoken, how we've taught, that has made it possible for people to think in that way? What do we do to change that? And I would say the same about Muslim leaders, about Buddhist leaders, about Hindu leaders, about all the great world faiths, because in all the great world faiths, in the last 30, 40 years, we've seen a growth of fundamentalism, which is rejected.
Any particular initiatives that you have taken in this direction?
Well, most of this stuff is done behind the scenes, but we are working harder and harder talking together and then doing joint projects together. The partnership of action is better than the partnership of endless talking, because action speaks to other people. For instance, both Christians and Muslims supported Muslims caught in the floods and earthquakes in the Himalayas a few years ago. Muslims have supported Christians where they've been caught in natural disasters. After the killings in Christchurch in New Zealand a few months back, we had a gathering at one of the great mosques of London of Christian and Muslim leaders to be honest with each other. What we don't want is what I've been calling here tea and cake interfaith dialogue. That means we get together, we have a nice piece of cake, and we all say, isn't this a nice piece of cake? And we have a cup of tea and we say, Sri Lankan tea is just wonderful, and this is nice tea. And then we say to the press, we were in agreement over everything. We were in agreement over tea and cake. We were not in agreement over other things which we did not dare speak about. Interfaith dialogue must be honest, it must take responsibility, it must be determined.
How do you break through that, though, to get there? Because, I mean, but this, what you are saying, this lip service, to me also, I find it almost cynical sometimes, you know.
Exactly.
And how do you break through to ensure that you're actually getting to reality on that?
Well, as they say, that's the $64,000 question. I think, first of all, you have to build a relationship. Secondly, you have to be willing in private to have tough conversations. I've recently got better at that. I have to confess, be honest with you, I do not like confrontation in private or public. I'm not that confrontational kind of person. And therefore, if I'm sitting with someone I like, I don't want to say, look, I'm really worried, I think this is wrong. But we're learning to do that. I did that a couple of years back and in a book, and it caused some tension. And we had a meeting with Muslim leaders in England, and they expressed themselves very clearly, quite properly, but very clearly and forcefully, and I expressed myself clearly. And I think we grew closer as a result, not further apart.
It's better to do this behind the scenes, you think?
Usually. Much as I admire, genuinely, I'm not being cynical, much as I genuinely admire and respect the media, doing things in public is not always the best way. When you humiliate someone by challenging them, and perhaps by them not having a good answer at the time, it damages relationships.
I hope you had this conversation in Sri Lanka as well with your counterparts.
We've had a similar conversation about the need for honesty and taking responsibility.
Then comes the issue of the next generation, because
Yes.
sometimes I feel that our generation, maybe it's too late to change things, that it's the future generations that have to make the difference. How does one make religion as a whole, I mean, in your case, obviously Anglicanism, but relevant to the youth today, and hopefully change some of these prejudices that we seem to have with our generation?
Well, I think you're being very kind, because I think you're quite a lot younger than I am. But I think I would not say how do we make, well, I'm going to talk as a Christian, how do we make Christian faith relevant to the younger generation? How do we stop making it irrelevant? Mm-hmm. Of course, Christian faith is deeply relevant to young people. It's about purpose in life. It's about being loved. It's about the formation of community. It's about the care of creation. It's about the most adventurous, exciting life you could have. What in the past, too often, many churches have done is to turn that extraordinarily exciting package that is the gift of God to human beings into something that sounds like only you must be good, turn up at church, and be quiet until you're in your 60s, and then we might listen to you. My kids would say to me, "Dad, dream on." That isn't going to happen if I took that line. I have found in England, which is one of the more secular countries on earth, in the last few years, that when I unpack with young people with honesty and saying when I don't know, the excitement of Christian discipleship, they're leaning forward in their seats. Because, and particularly when you talk about community and the environment, because they look ahead 40, 50 years, they'll have to be the people who don't deal with a future rise in sea level and more storms and greater pollution and plastic oceans. They have to deal with the reality even more than we do.
The social media and technology, does it help or hinder these discussions?
Both. I think where it helps is it enables us to know what's going on, to stay in relationship with people. With a Facebook group or WhatsApp group, with Twitter, when used well, it can be a way of conveying information, of resisting tyranny, we've seen that in many places, of standing up for the dignity of the human being, of bringing to people's attention the sorrows that some people suffer in a way that is powerful. But when it's used badly, it is a great tool for terrorism. It enables people to have information about people, but not a relationship with them. So all you read is what you see in your smartphone or on your screen. What you don't know is what's that person really like. When you see a politician, you think, oh, it's a terrible man. Everyone tweets. Oh, you know, at whatever their name is, has just made the most terrible statement on television. You may not know that the day before their doctor told them they had a fatal disease. You may not know their wife is very ill. You may not know one of their children's sick. You don't know them. It doesn't mean that they're right to say bad things, but when a friend does it, you think, that was stupid, but he's having such a tough time. And so social media can tell us about something, but it can't give us a relationship.
Do you have this conversation with
Yes.
I mean, the fact
social
that
media companies.
you do.
Yes.
You have spoken with Facebook.
I have
and
indeed, particularly Facebook, and they see the point. I don't think, well, I'm sure they don't agree with me, but they do see the point we're making and finding ways of, well, particularly stopping its abuse. But there's an old saying that the answer to abuse is not no use, but right use.
At the moment, internationally, I guess you feel the same way. There is a sense of despair that about what we are going through at the moment. And you mentioned also the bigger issues like climate change, but then we're also looking at the relationships among us as human beings, like increasingly coming under stress, whether it's race or religion or any other way we want to differentiate ourselves these days. Are you an optimist or a pessimist on this?
You will find I've said this before, I'm neither. I don't really put a lot of weight in pessimism, which is my personal natural inclination, or optimism. I'm a Christian, and that means that I believe that in history, Jesus Christ rose from the dead and conquered death and evil. And that means I'm always full of hope, that however bad things, there is no cause for ultimate despair.
There's another debate that we have in Sri Lanka, but I think internationally also, church and state, if you will. I mean, historically, in each religion, these things have got mixed. But in a modern society, where do you draw the line in your view? How do you draw the line?
Well, I think you draw the line quite broadly. I would say that Aristotle, the ancient classical Greek philosopher, spoke of the polis. It's from a Greek word from which we get the word politics. Right. And that every citizen and organization is part of the polis. So everybody is in politics. They may not choose to be, but every time they buy something, they make a political decision because supply and demand affect politics. The moment the church can't escape from politics. Religious leaders can't escape from politics. Merely by existing, they're in politics. But that does not mean that we are in party politics. And it is very rare, it does happen, but it is very rare that religious leaders should take a party political view. You go back to the 1930s, clearly the Christian leaders in Germany should have stood up against Hitler. That would have been party political and right. But those circumstances are very, very unusual. And they're really only in the great crises. Most of the time, the church is there, and I think other religious leaders, to be a voice for the poor. In an old cliche that I don't like, but I'm now going to use, to speak truth to power.
To be a conscience, I guess, also.
To be a conscience, to model integrity and transparency, not pretend they're better than anyone else, but to model being honest about failure and willing to change.
We are coming to the end of our program. You are in Sri Lanka. We are a resilient country in many ways. We've gone through a lot, as you know, our history, especially our post-independent history. We had this great tragedy the last Easter Sunday. What is your message before you leave to the Sri Lankan people? Is there something you would like to directly tell them?
I think I'd like to say two things. First of all, I would say that the tragedies are not only post-imperial. I think imperialism, many good people served in imperial civil services, but the idea of imperialism is a tragedy for its victims. And I think we must be honest about that as British people. I think the second thing, though, from where you are now, do not allow the darkness of those who want to create division through terrorism, through ethnicity, violent division. Do not allow that darkness to overcome the light of your courage and resilience. To live in a post-conflict country requires courage. It requires vision. It requires recognition that reconciliation, the issue of reconciliation in a post-conflict country, is one that takes generations. Even in Europe, where the last great war in Western Europe was in 1945, we've made one of the best examples of reconciliation anywhere in the world after one of the worst examples of war. But yet there are still things that have to be dealt with. Reconciliation is a generational process. Be courageous, shine the light, meet up with other communities, use education, love and serve the poor. And Sri Lanka will be an example to the world. But it can only be that when it is remorselessly focused on the common good, on reconciliation, and on the care for the vulnerable and the weak.
Thank you, Your Grace, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.